The time has come to tell the truth.
I'll wake up and smell the coffee.
Today is the beginning of a new chapter.
Another future's possible, but we've got to fight for it.
Order!
Hello and welcome to the Debated podcast. As always, I'm your host, Will. And in this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Michael Mullaney, who is the leader of the Liberal Democrat group on Leicestershire County Council, was a Liberal Democrat parliamentary candidate in Hinckley and Bosworth at last year's general election, and has contributed to a fascinating new book about British by-elections. Welcome to the podcast, Michael.
Hello, Will.
It's great to have you on, Michael. Now, the first question I'd like to ask is, could you give us some information about how the book came about and how you got involved with it?
So Ian Dale often puts together sort of compendiums of different elections. So he's done one on British general elections before. And his latest one was British by-elections, 1769 to 2025, which is 88 different by-elections in Britain, each a chapter written by a different author. And he's got some sort of leading political academics that many people will recognise the names of, and leading political journalists, former government ministers to take part in the book. And each one looks at a different chapter in the book. I joined the project quite late. I think Ian was expecting originally to do 75, but he extended it to 88 because a number of people asked him to do other by-elections that hadn't been included in the original list. One of the new ones that was suggested was Workington 1976, which was the chapter I ended up writing for. So the book has now been published. It's over 700 pages long, and as I say, there's 88 different by-elections by different political journalists, politicians and academics. Absolutely.
And I think Ian touches upon in the introduction to the book about how British by-elections aren't unique to Britain, but there's something unique about the way that we do by-elections and the significance they can often have to our general politics. Why do you think that's the case?
So I think that they can have, to me, they have sort of three wider impacts. I mean, you can look at by-elections either in isolation and just say it's a contest for one parliamentary seat between candidates of different parties to elect one MP for one local area. And you can read the book like that, just of 88 chronological different by-elections between 1769 and 2025. But I tend to see that there are probably three different themes in which you can identify how by-elections impact British politics in the past. And also, I think these three sort of different themes also are potentially quite impactful on the future of British politics. So the first I'd say is that the by-elections are quite important in helping with third-party challenges or fringe party challenges, parties emerging from the fringe to become more mainstream, to the two-party system, because obviously we've had really probably since the Liberals fell to 40 seats in 1924, we've basically had a two-party system of Labour and the Tories. But the by-elections since then have allowed other parties the opportunity to really challenge that two-party system. So I think one of the key impacts of by-elections, and we can go through different periods of time where this has been the case, but is that it gives opportunities either to the Liberal Party originally, but later to parties like the Scottish Nationalists and the Welsh Nationalists, and then UKIP and now Reform and possibly the Greens in future, to challenge the mainstream parties. I'd say the second impact is that they can have a real impact on national leaders and policies. Either you can see their impact on the removal of party leaders or of ministers, or you can see their impact in terms of changes to party policy, government policies that are controversial, or possibly not governments not changing policies because of them. And I'd say going forward, you can see that potential impact of that as well, with question marks over different party leaders. And I'd say the third impact of by-elections is that they can resurrect or launch political careers. People who've lost seats in general elections can get back into Parliament and get back onto the front line of politics through by-elections. So I'd say those are the three impacts. They, number one, give third parties and emerging parties an opportunity to try and break through. Secondly, they can have an impact, the results of them, on national party leaderships and policies. And thirdly, they can give opportunities to existing politicians who've perhaps lost their seats and to resurrect their careers.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned a moment ago, your chapter is about the Workington by-election in 1976. Why did you want to write about that particular by-election?
To be fair, it had got towards the end of the book, I think, and Ian was looking for somebody to write a chapter on it, and I agreed to it. So it was sort of given to me rather than chosen. But it's an interesting one because on the surface, it may have seemed a fairly routine by-election. It was in a seat that had been one of the few seats that had voted Labour every general election since 1918. It was one of only 52 seats to elect a Labour MP in 1931. So on paper, Workington seemed to be a safe Labour seat. So you'd had Jim Callaghan not long as Prime Minister. He decides that the House of Lords is a place where there isn't much of a Labour presence. The Labour government suffering many, many defeats in the House of Lords. It had been going through record numbers of defeats under that Labour government. So he wanted to send somebody with substance to the House of Lords to lead the Labour group and to try and rally the Labour peers to sort of put up a more effective fight in the second chamber. So he basically invites Fred Pert, who is a cabinet minister, to resign his seat in Workington and go and become leader of the House of Lords, creating a vacancy, which was certainly a brave thing for Callaghan to do because the government had only been elected in October 74. Howard Wilson had obviously been Prime Minister originally before giving way to Callaghan with a majority of 3 seats. And they'd already lost the Woolwich West by-election in 1975 to the Conservatives. And they'd also seen John Stonehouse, who people may well know the story of him as disappearing in Australia and things. And he ends up leaving Labour for the English National Party before then resigning from Parliament or being forced out of Parliament. So by now, the Callaghan majority has no majority. And here he is causing a by-election, which on paper didn't need to take place. As I say, historically, it was a safe Labour seat, but actually in reality, it wasn't as safe a seat as might have been thought. The majority in 1974, although substantial, could fall on a swing of about 11% to the Conservatives, which isn't much for a by-election. And in the end, this unnecessary by-election takes place and Labour lose it to the Conservatives. And as a consequence, therefore, the Labour majority goes. So it's an interesting story of a seat that had been thought of as a safe Labour seat, but actually by 76 is not really that safe. And so Callaghan causes a by-election, which he didn't really need, and which Labour lose. And of course, there are many things that if I sort of look at what's the wider impact of the Workington by-election in 1976, I suppose the argument you can have is when the vote of no confidence takes place in the Labour government in 1979. They lose by 311 votes to 310. Well, obviously there may be many different causes for that, but one cause is the Workington by-election because he could have kept Fred Pert in the seat. They could have kept it as a Labour seat. He decides to send him to the Lords, cause an unnecessary by-election, and they lose it to the Conservatives. So I suppose it's a sort of tale of, don't be too complacent. Seats in by-elections are not necessarily as safe as you might imagine them would be.
Absolutely, and you mentioned at the start of the chapter as well, Workington being used in a slightly different context in 2019. Again, referencing the idea of it being a sort of like a staunchly safe Labour seat. And do you think that the kind of like the need to give a certain type of voter, particular sort of like name, Workington man being like the most recent example, perhaps sort of narrows down the way that we think of politics in some way. You mentioned Worcester woman as well, and Basildon man. Do you think that perhaps limits our understanding maybe at times of why particular voters change from one particular political affiliation to another, or do you think they're useful descriptors to have?
It can sort of identify a specific type of voter, particularly if certain areas are moving more towards one party than another. So I suppose Basildon Man in 92 was sort of reflective of the fact that Essex had swung more to the Conservatives during the Thatcher years than most other areas, but obviously a lot of the country had as well. And similarly in 2019, Workington Man was an area where Boris Johnson was beginning to win the red wall, and it was a way of, I suppose, it's a way of just capturing a wider picture of how voters are changing in particular seats.
And in terms of sort of like by-elections, one of the things that definitely comes through in the book, and I think it's been commented on quite often, particularly recently, is how successful Liberal Democrats are at winning by-elections. What do you think it is about the Liberal Democrats as a party that means that they are able to quite often win by-elections very easily? Is it simply by virtue of being a third party, or is there something about the approach that Liberal Democrats take in by-elections that's perhaps different from, say, the Conservatives or Labour or other parties?
So I think by-elections, one of the main impacts they have is they give opportunities for third parties, and certainly the Liberal Party for many years, to challenge the two main parties, Labour and the Tories. So basically, since 1924, when the Liberals collapsed to 40 seats, you had sort of two-party politics between Labour and the Conservatives. But every so often, you get these periods of time when parties, Liberal Party and then successor parties, the Liberal SDP alliance and the Liberal Democrats, challenge the Conservative Labour hegemony. And you see these at different periods of time. So obviously 1962 and Orpington was sort of the first time this sort of majorly happens, around the time of the Macmillan government becoming unpopular, and Orpington, which had been a very safe Conservative seat, falls to the Liberals. You then see later on in the early 70s a series of by-elections falling to the Liberals. You see Sutton and Cheam, Berwick-on-Tweed, the Isle of Ely. As the Conservative government becomes unpopular in the early 70s, the Liberals mount a big challenge. And then again, the biggest one, of course, was in the early 80s with the Liberal SDP alliance. And you see the alliance gaining Crosby, Glasgow Hill Head, Croydon Northwest in by-elections at the end of 1981, 1982. And each of these sort of surges leads to a sort of momentum in the polls for the Liberals, and then later the SDP Liberal Alliance, and bigger votes at the general election. So the by-elections of the early 70s lead to the 1974 election, when the Liberals get nearly 20% of the vote, although they only get 14 seats. And then 1983, when they get 26% of the vote, only 2% behind Labour, but because of the voting system, and the party hadn't quite cottoned on to how to break the voting system at the time, only 23 seats. So by-elections have been very important for the party in sort of bringing about breakthroughs and bringing about momentum. And often the two parties can be unpopular. You can have unpopular Conservative governments and then Labour oppositions, which are also unpopular, and that gives the third party an opportunity. And certainly the Liberals are quite skilled at, winning by-elections. If you look at the different seats they've won over the years, they've often won them with very big 25, 30% swings. And it has been a way in which the parties survived, but also then made progress. And so you see in the early 90s, in the run up to the 97 election, them winning Newbury and Christchurch and Eastleigh and Littleborough and Saddleworth, and that leads to the breakthrough in 97 when they get 46 seats. And more recently, you see the series of by-elections from 2021 onwards: Cheshire and Amersham, Tiverton and Honiton, Somerton and Frome, North Shropshire, where the party makes all these gains in by-elections, and then that leads to the big breakthrough in 2024 when they get 72 seats. So by-elections are very important for the Liberal Party in terms, and the Liberal Democrats later on, in terms of getting momentum and really building the party in the run-up to general elections.
Absolutely. And one of the things I think that's interesting that you point out in the chapter you've done on Workington is turnout can be very decisive, and often people complain that turnout at by-elections is perhaps down on a general election, or say that obviously the result of the by-election will be determined by how many people bother to turn out and to vote. Do you think that there is a perception amongst the public about the importance of turnout, about by-elections, or do you just think that generally the reason that by-elections often, though not always, have low turnouts is simply because, unlike a general election where it's been signposted for a while and, people are a bit more prepared for it and know other people in other constituencies who are having to vote, it seems almost like a bit of an imposition if you're living in a seat that has a by-election and sort of like interrupting your daily routine to go and vote, and you've got all these people coming around and trying to canvass you, and it feels more of a pain rather than something, to make your voice heard in the context of a general election.
I think that it depends a lot on how hard the parties fight the by-election and whether there's a sort of wider impact that the election has that can sort of generate if a turnout's going to be high or isn't. So if you look at the lowest turnouts, there was Leeds Central, I think the one that Hilary Benn won in 1999, when I think the turnout was about 19%. And similarly, I think when Lucy Powell won Manchester Central, I think 2012, the turnout was very low there as well. I mean, these were sort of safe Labour seats where there wasn't much chance of the seat changing hands. Where an election is really closely fought and where it might have an impact, then I think the turnout can be higher. So, yeah, I mean, in Workington, the turnout was very high and was sort of on a par with the general election. But on the same day, there were two other by-elections in Walsall North and in Newcastle Central, where on paper the Labour majorities were bigger. In Workington, the turnout actually held up quite well, and that possibly explains why the swing against Labour was lower and that they only just lost the seat by 1,000 votes, whereas bigger majorities were lost in Walsall North on the same day. And in Newcastle Central, they held the seat, but with a much bigger drop in majority. So I think often it depends on how important is the by-election to the sort of wider political scene. And if it's competitive, sometimes a seat may be so safe that one party, like in Leeds Central in 1999, is so expected to win that turnout just collapses.
Yeah. And do you think that the message of the book in terms of the importance of by-elections is one that will feed through to politicians? Because sometimes there's a sense that by-elections can happen and they can predict a particular result, but for the party that is on the receiving end of a by-election defeat, they can just sort of dismiss it and say, oh, it's, sort of like just people venting their frustration. They're not going to change their minds come a general election. I'm thinking particularly in the run-up to the last general election, as you mentioned earlier, Liberal Democrats winning a series of seats that had previously been strongly Conservative on quite substantial swings, and you would hear Conservatives saying, oh, well, no, this is just mid-term blues. I think Rishi Sunak used as an interesting term at one point in reference to a by-election loss. Do you think that if a politician were to read this book and to see the repeated pattern over not just decades but centuries as to the importance of by-elections, that might maybe change the way that they engage in them and maybe change the way that they respond to patterns of by-elections? Or do you think it's just sort of like hardwired in that if you're on the receiving end of a by-election loss, you just have to dismiss it?
You're right. There is definitely a pattern you can see. And it was quite interesting that in the run-up to the 2024 election, a lot of the Conservative response was quite similar to the on a by-election night when they've lost a safe seat. It was very similar if you watch back the old, because they're still available on YouTube, some of the old by-election programmes from the 90s. The Conservatives had the same response then, and the response was usually, oh, well, it was because our voters didn't turn out, and they'd often say, oh, well, Labour only got, or Liberals only got the same vote as the last general election, and our vote just didn't turn out. I mean, there was Dudley West in 1994, which sort of historically had the biggest swing from Conservative to Labour of 29%. The Tory vote totally collapses, almost disappears. But on the night, the Conservative says, oh, well, the Labour only got the same vote they got in 1992 general election when they lost. Well, yeah, it's true, but you went from like 29,000 to 7,000. If you don't think that's a problem, then you're being a bit naive. And of course, in 97, the Tories get absolutely smashed. And you see the same pattern in the run-up, as you say, to 2024. They're losing these safe seats, whether it's to the Liberals in Tiverton and Honiton and Shropshire North, or whether it's to Labour in Selby. And often they'll sort of, they'll come out with the argument that, oh, well, the Labour vote's no bigger than it was at the last general election. Well, yeah, but your vote collapsed and it hasn't turned out. So whether it's just trying to cope on the night and just have an excuse to the bad results, or whether it is that there's a sort of naivety that your supporters will automatically turn out at the next general election. Sometimes they do. I mean, obviously the Tories had those disastrous by-election defeats in sort of 1981 when they lose Crosby and Croydon Northwest to the SDP Liberal Alliance. And then 1983, Thatcher comes back again. But obviously events happened in between. The Falklands War and a change in economic policy that means that by the time of the 83 election, things had sort of changed radically in politics to allow the Tories to win again.
What would you say is is there a particular by-election that you think stands out, especially as being remarkably different from any of the other by-elections mentioned in the book? I'm going to bar you from selecting your own in this instance, but there are any others that you think especially stand out as being just so maybe outside a general trend as to a by-election that it is perhaps a bit surprising to read about it?
Well, I'll be honest, I don't think my chapter is in the sort of top 10 or even top 20 of the most important by-elections. So no, I mean, there were quite a few others that were much more significant in their impact of politics. I'd say I think one of the big impacts of by-elections is they can change government policy, or they can change the makeup of government. And I'd say probably the most significant by-election is Newport in 1922. It's a chapter in the book that a colleague of mine, Stephen Williams, who used to be a Liberal Democrat MP and government minister, he writes the chapter. And Newport takes place in 1922, just before the meeting at the Carlton Club of Conservative MPs to decide the future of the government, because after the 1918 war, there is the 1918 election, which is fought with Lloyd George at the head of it and part of the Liberal Party in alliance with the Conservatives. So after 1918, you have a coalition government with part of the Liberal Party under Lloyd George, with the Conservatives. Part of the Liberal Party under Asquith goes into opposition. And so you have this Conservative Liberal coalition government. A lot of Conservatives are getting restive about it. They want to change. They want to move away from Lloyd George. They want a new sort of Conservative-led government. They have this by-election in Newport, which is sort of, the Conservatives don't think they've got a chance of winning. They expect it to go Labour. And the Conservatives end up winning the by-election. And it happens just before this meeting at the Carlton Club of Tory MPs. And so obviously the coalition under Lloyd George and Austin Chamberlain, who was the Tory government, put the coalition to the vote. And most Tory MPs vote to leave the coalition government. And one of the general views is that the Newport by-election had a big impact on that result, because Conservatives suddenly thought, well, if we can win somewhere like Newport, which wouldn't necessarily be seen as traditional Tory territory, in a by-election, then actually we're popular enough to win on our own. And in fact, Bonar Law then goes on to win the 1922 general election quite comfortably, although he then throws away his government by calling an unnecessary election in 1923. But yes, I'd say Newport was the most significant of the by-elections, but quite a lot have had big impacts. I mean, another one that had a big impact on politics is the Kinross and West Perthshire by-election of 1963, when Alec Douglas-Hume is allowed to return to the House of Commons via a by-election. Macmillan resigns as Tory Prime Minister. They need to find a replacement. Alec Douglas-Hume is in the Lords. The general view is that in the 1960s, it's too much of a modern age to have a leader in the House of Lords, so they've got to be in the House of Commons. There'd been a big furore a year or two earlier with Tony Benn having inherited the title of Viscount Stansgate and having to stand down from his Bristol South East seat. He forces a by-election, wins it, but the Tory MP takes the seat, even though Benn won the election, because Benn is disbarred by being a member of the House of Lords. And there's this big row and big argument. He reruns the election and wins, and then the government brings in the Peerages Act, which allows hereditary peers to renounce their peerages and stand with the House of Commons. And so that allows Alec Douglas-Hume to stand in this by-election in Perthshire and get elected and become Prime Minister.
And I think the message there certainly is, don't have unnecessary elections, both in the case of Bonar Law with the general election and certainly Jim Callahan with the Workington by-election. Well, we're coming towards the end of the podcast, Michael. It's been wonderful to have you on, but I do have one final question. For anyone who has read the book or is going to read the book, what one thing do you hope that they would take away from the book, whether it be your own chapter or the book as a whole?
Well, I think that it is that by-elections can have real impacts on governments. They can impact on who the Prime Minister is or on major national policies. They can also, restore political careers as well. And people who were in the wilderness and who lost their seats can be returned to Parliament, whether it's you go way back into 1918, Asquith loses his seat in the general election because even though he'd been Prime Minister during the war, he wasn't sort of seen as being pro-war enough because he goes into opposition to the Lloyd George government after being removed. He loses his seat in 1918, but he gets back in the Paisley by-election of 1920. Similarly, you have people like Shirley Williams, who loses her seat in Stevenage in 1979, but she manages to get back in the Crosby by-election in 1981. Michael Portillo famously lost his seat in 1997 at Enfield Southgate. He manages to return in a by-election in Kensington and Chelsea in 1999. So they can be a way of resurrecting political careers. And of course, looking to the future of politics and in the impact of by-elections in future. Of course, there's been a lot of talk at the Labour Party conference around Andy Burnham and can he return and so on. And obviously a by-election is the route back for him if he manages to get selected and if the Labour NEC agree to him being the candidate. So they are a way in which, major political figures who lose their seats can sort of have another chance in the political arena without having to wait for a general election.
Absolutely. Well, thank you once again for taking the time to speak to me, Michael.
Thank you, Will. It's been good conversation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. If you've enjoyed it, you can subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, Podbeam, and Amazon Music. You can also follow us on Twitter @Debated Podcast, like us on Facebook, Debated Podcast, and if you'd like to get in touch with us, whether about appearing on an episode of the podcast or commenting on an episode that you've listened to, you can do so at thedebatedpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. I hope you listen to the next one.